I see you Monday too.
Yes, I can look at it over.
What are we doing?
Innovation Conference.
Well, good, that's right, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen.
I'm just trying to get through Saturday.
Oh,
about-
believe me, I'm day to day right now.
Saturday about 5 o'clock, my life changes.
Ready?
What happened?
Graduation's over.
Oh, that's right. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
It's all
Dr.
over.
Seibert, would you call the roll, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Dr. Bullock? Mr. Childers?
Hang on. Yes.
So you're both present?
Hang on.
Dr.
I'm
Bullock?
here. This is Ann.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, you both spoke at the same time. I just wanted to check there. Okay. Dr. Bullock is here, yes. Mr. Childers is here.
I am here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dempsey is here. Dr. Fleming? Ms. Janeski?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. McKinney? Dr. Graham?
Here.
Thank you. Ms. Hyatt? Dr. Houston is here. Mrs. Jones?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Lakis? Dr. Locklear?
Here.
Good morning. Miss Loftus? Okay. Dr. Marr? Dr. McIntyre is not here. Dr. Miller's here. Dr. Weddington is out. And Dr. Wood.
Here.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the May 9th, 2019 meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation programs. My name is Patrick Miller, and I'm chairman of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Commission members, you have had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the May 9th, 2019 meeting?
So moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the agenda for today's meeting. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
The agenda has been approved. Thank you. The minutes from our previous commission meeting on April the 11th, 2019 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
Motion to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the minutes from the April 11th, 2019 meeting. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
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 And the minutes have been approved. Thank you very much. Now Dr. Kim Evans is going to provide the State Board of Education and NCDPI updates. Dr. Evans.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Today I have 3 items to review. The first 2 are policy changes that were approved by the State Board, and the first one has to do with CTED 004 It was an update to their policy manual, and they had multiple changes to that policy manual. And then to LICN 001 and LICN 003, the change had to do with safety and driver education license, adding the safety and, the safety and traffic education program. I'm sorry about that. STEP, and all the requirements, including 80% passing on the assessments. So the assessment requirement was listed in 003, LICN 003, and all other requirements, including the blended learning model that was part of the program, is listed in LICN 001. My last update has to do with the panel that was part of May 1st of the state board this past month. It was requested during the April meeting by the State Board of Education to have a panel discussion around the principal pipeline, and the panelists included NCDPI's Dr. Robert Sox, Dr. Shirley Prince of NC Papa, Dr. Tim Drake of NC State University, and Mr. Tabari Wallace, the Wells Fargo NC Principal of the Year. And all these members of the panel were members of Pepsi's subcommittee, which is the Principal Standards Committee, who is revising the NC standards for the School of Executives. These are the 4 questions that were posed, and I wanted to also go into highlights next, but I wanted to give you a snapshot of what those questions included. And it really talked about the general health of the pipeline, some policy barriers, what the greatest improvement strategies could be, and then their own personal perspectives on the principal pipeline. Some of the discussion highlights included how to build the pipeline and how important that was to build the pipeline. And Dr. Prince, particularly, she brought up the RAND study, which is called Principal Pipelines, a Feasible, Affordable, and Effective Way for Districts to Improve Schools, and how that was a way that pipelines definitely needed to be built, and how affordable that could be, and something that could be scalable for the entire state. And then the second highlight had to do with strengthening the mentorships between principal candidates and the mentors that are within the schools, and making sure that the matches for those interns were with the best mentors possible, and making those matches possible through strong partnerships between EPPs and school districts. And some of the further thinking that came out of this panel was determining whether the teacher candidate process, so the selection process that we have presently for teacher candidates, could actually be transferred to how you hire principals. How to defining the qualities of a good principal, and then being able to move helping assistant principals to then move to being principals, and determining what the clear definition of how North Carolina licenses principals, how they actually are able to license principals, and what that process looks like. Any questions about the panel or any of the updates this morning?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Evans. I think you're still on deck to talk about test code revisions and cut score revision for LICN 003.
Yes. So this morning we have two different assessments that are being looked at for 003. And the first one is CKT, and that is a test code change only. So the old test code for CKT math subtest is 7803, and the new test code is 7813. So the old test code will stay in effect until August 2020, and so the date of the last administration will be during that month. And then the new test code will be available starting September 2019. So within policy, it states that the ending date for math subtests will be until September 2020 to make sure that we cover the month of August. And then for the old test code 7813, the effective date would be September 2019, beginning September 2019. And the second test has to do with reading specialist on the bachelor's level. And that is the teaching reading 5204, which is the old code. And that will stay effective until August 2020. And the new code is 5206, and that is effective also September 2019. And there's a revised, since the test has been revised and has been updated, the new cut score is 156, whereas the former cut score is 159, or the current cut score is 159. And 3 panelists that were included in creating that cut score by the vendor were from North Carolina. So North Carolina was included in creating that cut score or making that decision. Any questions?
So why will the two codes overlap again for a year? For the 7803 and 7813?
They're just giving an extra year to administer the test
Okay.
with the old code.
Just out of curiosity, has nothing to do with the recommendation, but do you have any idea how many right wrong responses would change your score from 156 to 159?
I do not. It could possibly be within the study that was attached to the item.
We can also, I mean, it could be.
I can also follow up with our vendor representative.
But it's just of interest to me. It could be a
Sure.
single item. It could be-
Sure.
I mean, that's a slight difference on the scale.
Right, right. It still has 90 questions, or it's still 90 minutes. I think it's still 90 minutes and 3 constructive responses. So the setup is still the same. Some of the distribution and some of the content areas were revised. So I did see that for the reading, teaching reading.
Any other questions? If not, do I have a motion to approve the revised cut score of 156 and code 5206 for the teaching reading K-12 test 5204 and revised code 7813 for the praxis CKT math test 7803 in policy LICN-003? That's a mouthful. Do we have a motion?
This is Glenda. I make a motion.
Thank you, Glenda. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion
This
and
is
a,
Aaron Fleming. I'll second it. And I've been on the meeting here for a little bit, but I didn't make it in time for the roll call.
thank you, Aaron. So we have a motion and a second to approve all that you just heard me read. I'm not going to read it again. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
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 Are there any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you very much. Next, Dr. Tom Tomberlin will discuss legislative updates. Dr. Tomberlin.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
So there are 3 pending House, Senate pieces of legislation that I would like to share with you this morning. And chiefly because they have implications for the commission should they pass and be signed by the governor. The first one is House Bill 979, which is titled High Quality Professional Development. This bill would require Pepsi and the State Board of Education to develop at least 5 professional development courses for teachers in local school administrative units, which I assume would include charter schools. Each course shall be based at least on one of the following instructional models. So online learning, online instructor-led learning, blended courses, which is a hybrid between face-to-face and online instruction, and then C, self-paced courses. So if those should pass, then it is likely that the commission will need to develop a subcommittee with experts from here within the department to assist in the creation of these 5 courses, which would also be offered through, presumably through our online platform, the Canvas platform, which is located in our NESA system and part of home base. So that's the first one. The second one is Senate Bill 219. I think I've discussed this quite a bit with everyone in the state. So if this is a repeat for any of you on online or in attendance, I apologize. But it's a pretty important bill that's coming forward. Senate Bill 219 is looking to modify the teacher licensure requirements. And the first change that's been made is that, that's recommended, is that teachers have 3 years to complete the testing. So that aligns with the term of the IPL, or potentially could align with the term of the full term of a residency license. The requirement, however, has shifted a little bit in that the time limit is based on the length of the license rather than the number of years of teaching. In the past, if a teacher had to teach in order to trigger the testing requirement. So you could be issued an IPL if you didn't teach or didn't teach enough in a school year for a full year, then the requirement was not triggered to attempt in the first and pass in the second. This changes that to the attempt must be made in the first year of the license, regardless of whether the teacher is employed in teaching or not, and then it must be passed by the 3rd year of the license. So that's the first situation. One thing that we're struggling with, and a piece of feedback that we've tried to give back to the bill drafter, is we're unsure what the attempt in the first year, if that is not made, and history, our recent working with the attempt in the first, pass in the second policy has led us to understand that there are a non-trivial number of teachers out there that just do not attempt in the first year. We assume it's because they forget, or they're consumed with the difficulties of first year teaching, and in some cases they do not make that attempt. To me, the law seems to read that if they don't make that first attempt, then they don't have, then they would be precluded from completing the requirement at the end of year 3. We don't think this is the intent, but we've kind of pushed back and asked for some clarification on that language. The second is monitoring compliance. The State Board of Education and the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction are required to monitor teachers' compliance with meeting the testing requirements for licensure. So we're interpreting that to mean an annual letter to teachers to indicate whether that they have not completed that requirement, or that they have completed that, or we recognize that their attempt, or that they've passed the test and completed the requirement. And then finally, in section E, conversion to a continuing professional license. This is what makes the attempt in the first language problematic for us. The state board shall not convert an IPL to a continuing professional license for a teacher who has not fulfilled the examination requirements of this section. So we are precluded from or we are prevented from converting the license if they didn't meet the requirement stated above. And one of those requirements is attempt in the first. So we feel that that language needs to be really carefully parsed before this bill goes into law, because we certainly don't want to deny a teacher the opportunity for a license just because they failed to attempt in the first year.
What is it, what would the possible opposition to that be?
I don't know. I think the legislature is trying to impress upon us the importance that folks are trying to pass the test throughout the IPL process, and that people aren't just all waiting to the end of their term to start trying to pass that test. We do believe, though, the way it's constructed puts the license in jeopardy from very early on, and that's what we want to try to avoid. This bill also creates a limited license. This is a 3-year non-renewable license issued to an individual who meets the requirements of the section. In order to be issued a limited license, a teacher must have been on an IPL and did not qualify to convert to a CPL because of failure to meet testing requirements. So testing requirements is the only reason that they're allowing for the limited license. This license is requested by the local Board of Education because the teacher is proven to be effective and will require an affidavit signed by the employing principal and the current superintendent in order to issue the license. The limited in the limited license name comes from the fact that the license is only good in the LEA in which it was issued. So there's no portability of this license from one LEA to another. The teacher must remain in the LEA that issued it until such time as that teacher completes all the requirements of a CPL. And then we can issue them the appropriate license. These licenses can only be issued by school districts located in certain counties. So the county has to be a Tier 1 or Tier 2 economically developmental county. So Tiers 1 and 2 are the most economically disadvantaged counties in our state. Tier 3 counties, which are least economically disadvantaged. Tier 3 counties with populations of less than 100,000 can issue a limited license. So there are approximately 14 counties, I think, in the state that will not be able to issue a limited license under this requirement. Of course, Wake County and CMS obviously would not be able to, but other counties like Guilford and Cumberland County would not be able to issue limited license. In committee meetings that I've been present at, the bill sponsors articulated their concern that school districts in these counties, in these under-resourced counties, have a much more difficult time of keeping educators than those in the larger counties, and this is an attempt to kind of offset that the disparity. There was another thing I was going to say about this, but I can't. I'll take a pause and see if there's any questions or concerns.
Did you say that the limited license can be issued for 3 years? And did you say non-renewable?
It is a non-renewable. And when this originally came out, it was a renewable 3-year license.
So what's the difference in the teacher that doesn't achieve a passing score in 3 years? That's non-renewable too, right?
Right. You're referring to the IPL? Yes. The IPL is also non-renewable.
At the end of 3 years, if they haven't met the requirements, they have no license.
That is, well, the IPL expires. What this would do would allow one of these LEAs or charter schools that has the opportunity, that's allowed to issue one of these licenses, they can extend the license for that individual for 3 more years in an attempt to get them to pass the test. But they can only exercise that license within the LEA in which it was issued. So another way we're interpreting this is that so for Wake County would not be able to issue a limited license, for its teachers, but neither would any of the charter schools that operate within Wake County. And so if you think about counties with city school districts, if the county is designated as Tier 3 and has a population of greater than 100,000, then the city LEAs that are within that county would also be precluded from issuing one of these licenses. And then the final piece of this that I think is of interest to Pepsi is Section 2.5. If this bill passes, elementary education or special education general curriculum teachers with an initial license that expires on June 30th, 2019, due to failure to fulfill the licensure examination requirements, shall be granted an extension until June 30th, 2020. So it's not an across-the-board extension for all expiries in 2019. It is only for elementary education and ECGC.
Dr. Tomlin, would a teacher that was issued a limited license continue to advance on the salary schedule?
From our understanding, we think yes, because it is providing them. It doesn't seem to have any restrictions. It doesn't define it to be like what we would consider a permit to teach or anything. So we would suppose that this person would continue to earn service credit for time under that and progress on the salary schedule under that license. But that certainly could be a matter of policy that we introduce and make a recommendation to the State Board of Education.
Can I go back to 979 real quick?
Sure.
Okay. So Dr. Miller and I were just kind of talking briefly about 979, and I just wanted to kind of get on record. Our charge in the commission, with this commission, is to actually make rule recommendations for the State Board of Education regarding aspects of preparation, licensure, continuing education, which would be this. But it's about rule recommendations. It's not about creating professional development. I'm unclear what this bill is actually asking us as a body to do.
So the way I would interpret this is North Carolina Department of Public Instruction is on the hook to create these courses, which we will bring to you for your blessing, which we will carry those courses and your blessing to the State Board of Education
Okay.
for approval.
Okay.
We just wanted to be clear that we were not being asked to develop professional
Another
development.
subcommittee.
which
We
is-
certainly
which is
wouldn't
not what
dis-
we do. Okay.
We wouldn't exclude you from that process if you chose to be a part, but
And I'm just curious if other folks feel like, I feel like we hear a lot about the complicated nature of the licensure process and the number of licenses, yet we seem to continue to create new licenses and pathways and options, leading to more confusion about who is eligible for what license. So I just wanted to say, that doesn't really mean anything, but it just...
There'll be another one in the next bill that.
right, you might have wanted to save that statement for
Well, there you go. And then I think we'll hear more about the licensure section and backlogs and all of this too, but yet we continue to create more of these complicated routes, which we've tried to clean up, I feel like, with residency and some of the other things that we've done recently.
So, I think that's no small consideration that the licensure system, the online licensure system, functions very well for what it does, but its ability to articulate and handle more and more complex permutations of licensure than what it was originally designed to do is making this increasingly difficult. It's not a tremendously flexible system that we can easily go in and reconfigure every time a new license or a new set of requirements is developed. So this does present a challenge for the operations side of this. I do try to keep that out of the policy discussions, but it is no small consideration. And I appreciate you recognizing that.
Mr. McKinney, did you want to say something?
Well, on just a quick comment on 979 as well, because it doesn't really talk about what kind of professional development. So I just wanted to go on record that and I'm an NCVPS instructor for AP Euro, so I appreciate what we can give our students and serve our kids in that manner. But also, I'm a little hesitant as to what style, curriculum-wise, content-wise. I'm completely comfortable. But if it's equity and things like that we're trying to develop online professional development for. I'm a little hesitant to kind of jump into that. So I just wanted to kind of put that on record.
Thank you.
Dr. Tomberlin, back to 219 for a second. You mentioned that it's superintendent, based on the effectiveness of the IPL. What are we measuring effectiveness by? Do you feel?
So that would be at the determination of the local board of education and the superintendent.
Well, that's interesting.
There is not a clearly defined definition. Now, that could be a matter of policy. Certainly, it would be within the purview of this commission to recommend to the State Board of Education a definition of effectiveness. But I would, one note of caution on that, the tools we use to measure effectiveness currently, and I'm referring to the evaluation process, is highly variable across LEAs, and EVOS is limited to a certain number of teachers. So that does present a challenge for having a statewide definition of effectiveness.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously we've been thinking through that and talking about that a lot in subcommittee work. Me personally, I care more about the effectiveness in the areas we do have EVOS data for. And so that might be something we would want to consider as a commission, as we think about policy recommendations. If we have EVOS data, I would hate to just leave it up to the, interpretation of somebody if this is a good teacher or not when we actually have it.
In the original draft of Senate Bill 219, there was a provision that referred very specifically to EVOS, but that didn't survive through the committee, and we'll see it's in the House now, so we'll see what happens to it as it travels through the House.
But I do agree that effectiveness, that term effectiveness, is going to raise questions from the LEAs as to what that means. Quite honestly, I think there's going to be folks out there that want us to define it, and there are going to be folks that don't want us to define it. So it's a pretty tricky thing to get it just right.
Can and this may be a bookend to Michael's comment. As a member of the commission, I feel like it's important to add to this discussion. I find it highly inappropriate for the General Assembly to get into the business of, in essence, writing certification policy, and we haven't gotten to 521 yet, which is what this is doing. That just has fundamental problems and breakdowns in the process, and the General Assembly should not be in the business of writing certification policy. And the other problem that's tied to that is none of the key stakeholders want to create the message that we're lowering standards for the purpose of opening up the pipeline, unless lowering standards will open up the pipeline. And we can't have it both ways. We can't argue that we need high standards unless we need lower standards for some other purpose. That needs to be said. But I want to reinforce, I understand DPI is not in the same position I am as a commission member. It is always problematic when a legislature begins to write policy. We faced that at UNCW with the hurricane when we had internships that are prescribed in state legislation. And in order for our students to simply pass in their internship, we had to have a piece of legislation. That's a fundamental breakdown of the policy process.
With that, I will turn to House Bill 521. Traditional license for teachers are from other states. So this piece of legislation introduces the transitional license, or a TL, which is a 3-year non-renewable license issued to an out-of-state teacher who holds current licensure in another state. The traditional license shall only be requested by a local board of education, and the individual may begin the process to meet the requirements for a CPL as an out-of-state applicant while holding the transitional license. So the transitional license itself does not, in that definition, does not differ at all from an IPL, which is currently granted to out-of-state teachers. And the board recently passed Pepsi's recommendations for how to deal with out-of-state teachers and to facilitate the process of moving them towards a CPL in North Carolina. This, however, I think is aimed at actually affording the LEAs the opportunity to situate those teachers on the salary schedule in advance of certification by our licensure division as to their level of license and their years of experience. In section B3, if the LEA is acting in good faith, they may, after a review of the licensure documents and verifying the years of experience, may put that teacher on the state salary schedule at the place where they deem is appropriate. If subsequently licensure certifies that teacher at a lower level of salary, the LEA will not be responsible for paying the difference in salary. So if my teacher comes to me from Texas and has a clear license and 14 years of experience, and I place them on the salary schedule appropriately at an A-level 14 years of experience teacher, if licensure comes back and says, well, wait a minute, we called and checked 3 of those years, we can't count for whatever reason, you as the LEA acted in good faith. You had a verification form from Texas. You placed them on that 14-year salary schedule according to our established processes and procedures. The LEA is not responsible for repaying the differential in that salary from local funds. The state will just absorb that difference. So the reason this is important, and some of you are looking at me like, why is this a thing, is there is a lag time between a teacher coming to us and being employed and the licensure department certifying the license. In that interim, there are some districts that have really large licensing departments and that are very skilled at the licensing process. They can evaluate a candidate's license and years of experience and feel confident to place them on the salary schedule. If they make an error, that LEA has the funds, the local funds, to cover the difference. And that's an assumed risk that they're willing to take. But if we take a small LEA that doesn't have that kind of staff, and they make a mistake that results in thousands of dollars in salary differential, that is devastating for that LEA. And so what this is doing is allowing the risk to be reduced for those LEAs that act in good faith. They can go ahead and get them on the salary schedule. Those smaller LEAs are putting those teachers on subpay or paying them at the minimum salary until such time as licensure can clear the license and certify the salary. So this is just giving them the opportunity to pay them in advance. We have given feedback to the bill sponsors on this one that this doesn't require the creation of a new license. That will only serve to slow down the process that they're trying to speed up. What we recommend is there is a place in current legislation that could easily be updated to allow for this without the creation of a new license. We don't know if they're going to take our advice or not, but we have given that feedback to them. It's a genuine problem that that needs to be addressed, but it could be addressed in ways that are less, that create less burden for the licensure system.
Okay. Any further questions for Dr. Tomberlin?
Thank you.
Okay. Next, Dr. Seiberg will present the accountability model and sanctions model for EPPs for discussion.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So, this next item that I'm going to be sharing is a pretty complicated item, and it's taken quite a journey for us to get where we're at to be able to share all this with you. So, what I'd like to do, first of all, I want to acknowledge all the hard work that the subcommittees have done, as well as my colleague Kim Evans for orchestrating all the madness over the past however many months, 3-4 months now, maybe even 5. Because it has been, it's really important work, as you'll see, and it has important implications for EPPs going forward. My hope today is, this is a discussion item that I'll sort of walk through what's going on and some of the challenges that have cropped up because of some complications in how things were written in law. And then what I'd like to do is then sort of invite the chairpersons of the two subcommittees to be able to chime in and answer any questions or get into specific details as questions arise. So with that, do we have the PowerPoint for this so we can keep that rolling as well? Oh, thank you. So, whoops. Just make sure we're, okay, there we go. All right, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk through what is the current law and what the requirements and standards are in the current law for accountability. And then the subcommittees basically looked at that and came up with strategies for how those standards can be met. So that's part one. The second part is I'm going to share with you the challenge of how sanctions were written in law and how they negatively impact the ability to create a more nuanced approach to accountability. And I'm going to walk through those challenges as well as some alternative models that the subcommittees worked on to, again, address what they think collectively have thought is a better approach to this. So we have this idea of what has to happen and what would be ideal, okay? So given that, let's start with the overview. So this work began back in November of last year. 2 subcommittees were assigned this work. One was led by Andrew Lakis and that was for the assessment side, and that was a part of the work that the Assessment and Performance Subcommittee was handling. And then the second was chaired by Van Dempsey, and that was a subcommittee that sort of grew out of the Educator Preparation Subcommittee within Pepsi, and they were tackling the sanctions model. Now, you could make an argument that the accountability and the sanctions models are very connected, that it's hard to set up sanctions unless you understand clearly what's going on in the accountability side. And so to that end, there was some sort of cross-pollination happening. There were members of both subcommittees that were sort of sitting in from time to time on both, and that was deliberate so that some information could be shared back and forth. But because the work was so laborious and task-heavy, we didn't want to assign both of those objectives to just one subcommittee. It was just a lot of work. So we split it into 2 subcommittees, and then we cross-pollinated where we could. The other thing that we did was Kim worked behind the scenes to provide these subgroups with other states' models, including Tennessee and Georgia. And then we also got some important information from SREB states. They did some work behind the scenes as well to help populate and flesh out options and some critical thinking for these committees to do real rigorous work in their processes. So that's just a little bit of setup for what actually has been going on. So the accountability model requirements in Senate Bill 599, and again, this is what's currently in place. So what you see on the screen is essentially the the lawmakers have said, and the key here is at a minimum, the performance standards shall include the following things. And then they list 4 things, which are below there. One is the performance based on standards and evaluations. The second is the proficiency and growth of students taught by educators holding initial professional license using EVOS. The third is satisfaction surveys. And the fourth is the quality of students entering the EPP, which is interesting because that's an input, not really an output. So we have 3 outputs and 1 input in the current law. So what I want to draw your attention to here is that this is somewhat of a moving target because there are laws moving around that are being proposed, or bills rather, being proposed right now that could potentially pull the 4th one. And it makes sense because we've been saying this idea of outcomes is important and inputs are harder to, to be useful in a measure. And so one of the bill proposals is an option to pull number 4 and replace it with what you see at the bottom there, which is 4 alt, which is in House Bill 107. They've added this notion of a 2-year retention rate for individuals who've completed an EPP and are still remaining in North Carolina. So given the current law, we have 4 obligations and 1 possible alternative obligation. And then it's at the discretion of these subcommittees to consider, are there additional measures that should be a part of this discussion? Because as you see at the top, it talks about it being the minimum requirements. Any questions about that so far? Okay. So let's go really quickly through how the department thinks we can handle the accountability model given this information as well as the current thinking of the subcommittees. So the first standard, and again, these standards that I have laid out are kind of, if I'm toggling back and forth here, you see those numbers along the left-hand side of the accountability model requirements. Basically, I've aligned those with these, I've called them standards, right? So the standards that we're going to talk about are trying to address each of the accountability measures in the law. So the first one is teacher evaluation. And again, what we would use here is the principal evaluation of teachers using the North Carolina teaching standards. And that's something that EPPs have already been doing for some time now. And it's basically looking at the 5 different standards, teaching standards, aggregating them up. Pretty straight ahead on that one. And notice there is only one real measure that we can use to address that standard. I'm going to get to that in a minute. The second is standard 2, and that has to do with teacher impact. And in this particular standard, we would use EVOS data where we have it available and establish a student growth measure. Again, one measure to deal with that particular standard.
What happens for teachers who don't have EVOS?
But this would, it's a good question. So teachers that don't have EVOS, we don't have a measure to handle, so they would not get data, wouldn't be held for them or against them, and it would be one of multiple accountability measures in the grand equation. But you bring up an interesting point. So if I'm an EPP that doesn't have, I'm creating teachers that do not have EVOS data. That
You're increasing the weight on the other.
Correct. Yeah, potentially. But that's not necessarily the case, as you'll see the way the law is written. So the third standard, we named this stakeholder perceptions. They actually are asking in law for one survey. We actually have 2 different surveys. And again, this is sort of taking like different perspectives of the outcome of teachers coming out of an educator preparation program. So one is the recent graduate survey. So this is asking folks who just came out of an educator preparation program to answer a series of perception questions about their experience and the ways they were prepared to be a teacher. And then the second one is a principal survey targeting specifically beginning teachers in their first year and their perceptions of whether they were well prepared by the EPP or not. And so we would use those two measures. We have two measures in place that we could use towards that standard. And you should also know that both of those surveys have been in place for some time now. And so we have multiple years of data there. As of this coming year, we'll have 3 years of data in both of those surveys. So we can look longitudinally at smaller institutions and be able to look at that. Standard 4, and again, this is the original Standard 4, which is currently in law. If nothing else passes, the obligation in Standard 4 would be looking at the quality of students, which would be an input measure, and that would be looking at Core 1 pass rates, the Praxis Core 1 pass rates, and the entering GPA as measures towards, and those were specifically outlined as measures towards meeting Standard 4. If 107 passes, then the one we just looked at goes away, and an alternative would be what we would call candidate employment, and that metric would be a 2-year retention of folks teaching in North Carolina schools. So let me talk through that. So in a place like Brevard, which produces really high quality teachers, many of them do not necessarily stay in the state. This metric, so like if I had an institution that had 10 students graduate, but 8 of them went off to another state, we would not hold negatively the fact that folks went to other states. Rather, we would take into consideration the 2 that stayed in North Carolina and see how many of the 2 were retained over the 2-year period in order to look at that over time. Does that make sense? So we're not holding somebody, an institution, it's not a strike against them that their students are going all over the country. But those that are staying in North Carolina, to the degree that they are retained over 2 years, is what we care about. So that's Standard 4A. And then the subcommittee actually looked at a possible 5th standard. Again, we just talked about the minimum requirements, but there was some discussion amongst the subcommittee around accountability to take into consideration the quality of preparation, and that could be measured by either the EdTPA or PPAT, which is a pedagogy assessment, and the pass rates on licensure exams as a possible measure for EPP effectiveness. And I just want to draw your attention to the bottom of this slide. You'll see in the beginning here, essentially, we wouldn't start this, sort of drop the needle and look at data over 2 years in the past. We would actually, the point at which we would start, we would only have a measure for the 1920 school year, and then the second year we would collect data for 2021, so we would have 2 measures there. And then by the time we got to 21-22, we would have a complete picture of what's going on. So the fact that we are collecting this idea of taking the first year, passing the second year, needs to be taken into consideration. So this would be a sort of a latent effect. Were the broader commission to make this recommendation and for it to hold with the board. So that's a quick discussion of the different areas that are being discussed. And that, again, I sort of was starting this conversation just because I know this is complicated. This is what is currently going on in law. Now, the second component, which is a conundrum, is how the sanctions language is written in Senate Bill 599. And I want to draw your attention to the areas that are bolded and underlined in the sanctions. So in a warning, to warn an EPP, you're going to get assigned a warning status if you do the following things, right? But look very carefully at the language that's underlined there. On any of the indicators set forth in General Statute 115C 269.35 in any 1 year. So what they are saying there is that any one of the conditions that we just outlined, if I go back to this slide, on this accountability measure, any one of these, if they're not met, you can be sanctioned. And more importantly, the law goes specific into disaggregating by race, ethnicity, and gender. And so when you look at the sanctions language, this idea that you could be sanctioned by criteria on any of those areas and any of those sub-areas complicates the ability for the accountability model to be nuanced. Okay?
So basically what I hear you saying is you can knock it out of the park in 3 out of the 4 and be just barely below the threshold in the 4th and trigger sanctions, whereas an aggregate, if they were scored as an aggregate versus individually, you may avoid that.
That's correct. So what we're saying is that one subcategory of one population, one subpopulation, could cause an overall high-performing EPP to be sanctioned, and ultimately to be revocated. Right? Like we can go down the whole path towards that. Yes.
In the subcommittee discussions, and I think we talked across the two groups, to your point, Patrick, about knocking it out of the park, you could be turning out teachers who go into the profession who, on a performance measure like EdTPA, perfect, every single individual. But because the demographics of that population don't meet the legislation, you would be sanctioned.
You know, even to a greater extent, it could have an implication on who is accepted into programming.
Sure, because the EPPs are then going to stack the deck more carefully so that they don't get sanctioned, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So it has far-reaching implications.
Yeah, and I just want to add, and I hope Andrew agrees with what I'm about to say, so much of this now sits between what it was the subcommittees were attempting to do. So Patrick, most of the work early on was we were trying to figure out how to create a portrait of a program. So what we're assessing in essence is the quality of the program. That turned once we started to see the implications of the statute that caused us to have to restructure the way that we were talking about this. The subcommittees, I thought, did great work, but it ends up in the problem you just raised, which is you can knock it out on 3 of the 4, but that one, I mean, as I read this, if I don't know what the data is on all the EPPs in the state, virtually everybody's going to be sanctioned on something, according to the legislative component.
If we could just make sure we're speaking right to the microphone.
So the other thing I want to draw your attention to, and I'm sorry, I'm struggling to. Can you go back to the 4 criteria, or are we frozen? Oh, there we go. Good. So go back to there. So the other thing, actually forward one. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that, you know, fundamentally the committees felt really strongly that the value or the importance of each of these measures was not the same, right? So, at a basic level, not everybody agreed that the educator satisfaction survey should be weighted as impactful as some of these other measures. So, but because of the way the sanctions are laid out, there is no discrimination between. They are all of equal value at this point, okay? And that is the conundrum that these subcommittees have to navigate, and ultimately that the commission has to navigate. So, ultimately, what happens then is we've worked with the subcommittees, and the subcommittees came up with the following things. So, and these are hard to read, and I'm not going to go into the specific details because I think I want you to understand sort of the overarching thing, and then we can get into specifics at a later time. But essentially, given what the lawmakers said and the limitations and conflict between the sanctions and the accountability requirements, the accountability model that was derived from that is as follows, which is, do these various things and various things happen to you. And to that extent, once you get a sanction, this is how the sanctions are levied over time. So those two slides are sort of the way the accountability model has to be in play given the limitations and the conflict between the way the law is written. Okay, and long story short. So that's the first side. And again, this slide here, the thinking here is just what Chairman Miller expressed, which is this idea, if I create a hypothetical environment here, and you'll see across the top of that table, each of the accountability measures, you'll see the first four, and then you'll see the alternative, as well as the fifth possibility. And all of this is, at the will of the broader group. But this idea that you could potentially mishit on any subcategory, overall be doing well, but ultimately be sanctioned, right? So that's sort of a visual of how that works. So one of the things that came out of this discussion and sort of some of these aha moments that these subgroups were working on is potentially, is there an opportunity to make a legislative request and essentially draw attention to the conflict between the intent of the accountability model and the limitations of the sanction portion and how that sort of limits the ability to create a robust model that the accountability group thinks could be a better way of doing things. So let's take a look at how the groups looked at a better model, right? So again, this is, from this point forward, it's all moot. If the law doesn't change, we sort of have to be pigeonholed in what was already shared to this point. So the proposed law change and this would be a recommendation to change the language in the sanctions model of Senate Bill 599 to instead read, fails to meet an overall composite threshold score. So there we're actually saying, yeah, all those things still matter. Obviously, race matters. Obviously, gender matters. Obviously, ethnicity matters. Obviously, the accountability areas that the lawmakers have identified matter. All those things matter. But instead, the commission body thinks that these things matter differently, and an overall threshold would allow for some give and take and some flexibility so that these institutions wouldn't necessarily be sanctioned for what the subgroups thought were very limited conditions. Okay? Yes?
If we were successful in getting a language change like you just described, would we then have the ability within Pepsi to assign weights to the four?
Correct. So if the sanctions side were modified, then we can, it would be at the discretion of the committee and ultimately the approval of the board to weight those and consider where the threshold is and the various marks with which the EPPs would be held to. Yes. Okay. So that change, which, and again, I just don't, it's not clear to me, and we've had a lot of discussions behind the scenes, with the various subgroups. It could be that the intent of the law is to really hold everybody to account on all those different subcategories, right? And to that extent, that would really cause a lot of consternation and a lot of angst amongst the EPPs. But that could be the original intent of the lawmakers. We don't know. It could be that they just didn't see the disconnect between what was going on the sanctions side and what was going on the accountability side, in which case they might look at that and say, yeah, we need to change that so that there's some more flexibility.
Yeah, and to add to that, from the subcommittee discussions, the sanctioning in the disaggregate could lead to a program ultimately not being able to turn out teachers. So while it might speak unintentionally to a quality issue, what it does is in essence renders the institution unable to provide teachers because of one of the areas. And so UNCW, for example, which has an overwhelmingly white female population of students, we educate 300 a year who go out into schools. We would be able to educate, hypothetically, none of them, because of one component would become teachers. That's the ultimate outcome of the way this is written right now is that.
Right, and just to further flesh that out, that would be the assumption that it would lead to, right, the warnings and then the probation and then ultimately the revocation. So if we run that all the way out, then it potentially limits pipeline and limits the amount of teachers that are being produced within North Carolina.
If I could add to that, Sam, it is, as dean at UNCW, it is not our intention to get a pass. It is our intention to diversify our program to reflect the schools and the communities in which our graduates will go. But the solution to that is not to stop us from graduating teachers. It is for us to diversify the demographics of our population.
Sam, you're gonna...
Well, the sanctions, like, on any one of the identified areas. So, let's say you have a problem in one category, ethnicity. You resolve that problem, but then another one of those 4 categories pops up. Then the process starts all over. Correct?
Right. There's a lot of...
it could move around.
That's correct. So if I fixed one area and I had a warning there and another area cropped up, but I fixed that first area,
Then the process starts all
the
over.
process starts over, yes.
I was just going to comment that I think the other piece without any of this nuance is that you could have large programs that have high performing individual license areas and perhaps low performing other areas, and we're not able to distinguish those, and yet we'll punish an entire EPP for perhaps one piece where, you know, if there is nuance, an EPP could go in and target support to a particular license area or decide that perhaps it's not in their best interest to offer that license area.
Right.
So I think this is important. I don't know if you had those discussions as well, but I think that is one of the pieces we're missing too, is that we don't need the whole aggregated EPP. We need to know within an EPP which areas are high performing, which areas need some support.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothetical, which brings up a hypothetical for me I haven't thought through, but under the way the Senate Bill 599 is written in law, couldn't then you have a breakdown of larger EPPs? So for instance, NC State, you got a program that's great, you got a couple that aren't, sold it down. Technically, that program within NC State could apply through the EPP approval process through the state board
To be its own entity?
Yeah.
I don't think you. I don't know unless it was significantly different. Yeah.
apply to the EPP. Like I could have Andrew Lakes, the school of teachers,
Yeah.
as long as
I did see that application last week, yes.
Yeah.
it got rejected actually.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly. No, I mean it's just I think the point, the mental exercise, I'm like, oh, how do all these things?
Well, and then we're trying to fit this within the context of accreditation. We haven't even had an accreditation conversation in here, right? Because this all actually feeds right into the national accreditation process. And if you've got programs that are being sanctioned, well, that's reported under your accreditation piece. And when your accreditation visit comes up, you have to account for that in
Hard to
some way.
overcome, yeah.
And we did talk about that in the subcommittees. What is the relationship between this and if you're a CAPE accredited, CAPE?
Yeah.
If you're not CAPE accredited, what's the parallel expectation and how do these two things
Yeah.
speak to each other?
Well, and a strong state level program approval process helps us with CAPE, because then we don't have to put individual programs through the process, because CAPE is a unit accreditor, right? They're accrediting all of your programs, not the individual program. So it's really important that we have a state approval process that actually looks at individual programs, so we can make the claim to CAPE
The
that
connection, right.
you don't actually have to come in and do individual program reviews. You can continue to do overall unit reviews.
Okay, so given the proposed, again, just trying to recap, if we're going to move this towards the idea of talking with the legislature and making a recommendation to make that alteration, then what happens is, and my clicker is not working. Sorry. Trying to get to the next slide. So here, again, just going back to the example that we've illustrated earlier, this idea is that if an institution is falling down on, a particular element within the broader aggregate, they still would then have the opportunity to not be warned or ultimately sanctioned, probation or whatnot. It doesn't mean that they don't get that data or that we sweep some of those challenges under the table. That's not the intent. The intent is that all EPPs are going to get all this disaggregated information and ultimately use that for their program improvement. But it's more allowing for the flexibility to meet overall conditions, so that not literally everybody potentially could be sanctioned. So if we go to the next slide, so were this to go to fruition and were the law to potentially be changed, I just we want to flesh this out because this is where the work was really thoughtful and interesting by the two subcommittees. The one is that we can think about weighting some different models, right? So that the value of different components within this thing would be of different importance, right? So that not everything is equal. The second thing is the sanction model can then be sort of mirrored on the same 4-level system that's currently in place for teachers, principals, and superintendents. The idea of having a developmental a continuum, as it were, that you could be, insufficient or incomplete, moving to developing, moving to proficient, moving to exemplary, which again ties into some of these other models that North Carolina already uses. So given all this, and again, I don't know to what extent it's the will of Chairman Miller and others within the group to get into the details about this portion yet. But essentially, the subgroups have come up with a couple of options. This first accountability model emphasizes incoming candidate quality, EVOS data, and pedagogy assessments as the primary drivers for it. And you can see the different weightings that are associated with that. Option 2 would change some things around, and this model would emphasize more EPP candidate program experience and outcomes rather than just the tests. So there's some differences there, and obviously it's going to be, the commission is going to have to discuss, if we get to a point where this flexibility is allowed, then there's going to be a discussion point as to how we want to cut this deck. A third possibility that was brought up, and we haven't totally fleshed it out, was, well, what would it look like if we just did the minimum, which is just the 4 that were written into law? So take out any additional things and stick with the real, the basics. And we have not assigned percentages to that, but you could imagine that it could be the will of the commission to recommend that these would have weighted differences among them as well. So again, there's 2 models that are looking at all the different variables and trying to throw everything that they can into a rich and diverse, holistic picture of the institutions and what they're producing. And then the third option is, what is the bare bones minimum to meet the expectation that's in current law? So those are 3 models that would be put in place. And then, can we get me to the, thank you. There we go. And then, and again, I won't go into the rich detail that we have here, but the sanctions subcommittee then can operate and create a much more nimble, much more nuanced level of sanctions. And this would target leveraging exemplary schools to help support some of the schools that are challenged, and share best practices, and you just have we can also be deliberate in holding up institutions who are thriving, who are really showing rich and robust programs, and that's a point of celebration for the state, and as well as the institutions, and then to provide a series of progressive steps to take the approach of sanctions as more of a formative model and not just a punitive model, so that we can really support programs where we can. So to that end, the last thing I wanted to share with you, do we have another slide there? So again, a quick summary, and I do want to give you a timeline here. The summary here is that the subcommittees have been working for a number of months, really interesting, really critical work, a lot of deep thinking and a lot of careful thought from both groups, and I really deeply appreciate all the folks that were given their time and effort towards this. There has been a model that's been developed, and that model is somewhat limited, but we have that in place, and we can go with that should there be no changes or adjustments according to what's currently going on in law proposals. There is a strong urge from both subcommittees to make a recommendation to this body to consider asking the legislature for a legislative change in 599 that would cause some changes to the sanctions, which would allow more flexibility in the model development, which would allow these further discussions to flesh out a more nuanced model, a more formative model, so that's sort of what we went through today. And then the last thing I want to share here is when you look at 599, if you go to the very last page in 599, when we think about when these accountability sanctions actually come into fruition, the law says there's no accountability statuses assigned in 1819, that would be the current year, 1920, the next year, and 2021. Essentially what would happen is, what we're trying to do is create the model that all EPPs will understand they are going to be held to, so that the department can then kick out data in meaningful ways so that folks out in the field can say, okay, so if this was a sanctioning year, I would be sanctioned because of these three things. Now, despite that, I don't have to get the sanction this year, so I can process improve and work towards meeting those expectations and those new criteria, so that by the time it becomes consequential, which would be in 21-22, hopefully programs will have made those changes and everybody's high flying again and we don't have any issues. So I just want you to understand that we are running hard, and the legislature has asked Tom and I to go back and present to them what is the accountability model in the fall, so that they can have a clear understanding of what's going on and how's the online dashboard moving forward, all these things that are moving towards this new system. But in terms of actual accountability, it's sort of a soft, we're identifying areas of challenge, but we're not sanctioning for a couple of years. Okay, so with that, let me just sort of stand back. I'm sure that's a lot of information. I'm happy to answer any questions that are out there, and I also know that it's likely that Dr. Dempsey and Mr. Lakis have some additional things they want to add to it potentially. So, Mr. Chair.
And so before we open up for everyone to participate in a discussion, I'll yield to Dr. Dempsey and Mr. Lakis to see if you would like to make some comments before we begin the discussion portion.
Well, one, to thank both of the subcommittees, because it's phone call, and we did virtually, we did all of it through conference calls. And they were intensive, deep discussions. These were not, they were complicated. Andrew and Kim were excellent in terms of helping to facilitate that. I think the committees, it can speak for the committee I chaired. The goal was always to get to a model that we thought was going to help the EPPs to identify strengths, and if there were areas of concern, how to get better in those areas of concern. Number two, to collaborate across the EPPs. So once we had an EPP that may be struggling in a particular area, one part of the course of action was how do we get peer institutions and peer EPPs to support each other through some kind of technical assistance process. And I think that's a strength of this. And I cannot imagine that one of the goals of the General Assembly was to create the possibility that would reduce the number of teachers that were coming out of EPPs through an unintended consequence of an accountability model. So I think that when Andrew spoke to the nimbleness and the ability to be engaged in a continuous improvement model that was parallel to the other external pressures on EPP, such as CAPE, to be able to use the dashboard in a way that facilitated this work. I mean, subcommittees, I think, have done a really good and responsible job of getting to a reasonable proposal to go back to the General Assembly.
Yeah.
All right.
No, I would echo that. Dr. Dempsey's point, just the appreciation for the hard work that's gone into this from subcommittee members, from the cross kind of subcommittee group, Andrew and Kim. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer questions and just be part of the discussion. I don't really have anything else to add.
I just wanted to comment that, so I appreciate the work that the subcommittee's done. I think it was difficult work for sure. I do think we have a good model in the state, right? An example of how EPPs could support each other in this process, and that when we, prior to rolling out the EdTPA, we held a huge conference here in Raleigh that all of the EPPs in the state came together, and we had leadership and members from different EPPs setting up sessions and helping folks do that. And then I think engaging the North Carolina Association of Colleges and Teacher Educators, who has a subcommittee who just works on assessment, and that subcommittee, or it's now a special interest group, I guess, and they hold part of the annual conference is focused on continuous improvement for EPPs. So there's certainly a group in the state who could be leveraged to help with this process. So it could be a good role for that group as well.
Okay, other thoughts from the commission members?
My only thought is I hope we can get some kind of nuance, aggregate, or whatever you want to call it. Because there's going to be, I can't imagine trying to keep up with all of the different factors that could come to play over time at 51 or 2 institutions. That is going to be a major headache, if it can even be done accurately.
That's right. Yeah,
One
agreed.
thing I'll just add here, if you notice kind of option 3, which was a late addition, just going with what's there. The spirit behind that is that the sanctions approach isn't going to be changed, and that was the intent, and still remains the intent of the legislature, which is their prerogative. Then I'm of the mindset that we may be careful what we add in there, because if there's 4 things that every single EPP is going to be accountable to, and there's some strong ones there in terms of outcomes. We just, I don't know that we want to add and literally open up 7 or 8 things that one nick or one kind of sub-performing year could create, sanctions. And so just wanted to give kind of voice to that. The original work that the subcommittee took on was more focused on 1 and 2. You can see some back and forth and some rich dialogue we had around, is EBOS more important? Our principal evaluation is more important. Where does EdTPA sit, under that model? But just to name that for the commission, that the stripped down model is assuming nothing changes in the law.
Right. So I too would like to thank the subcommittees for their work, particularly in helping illuminate these, what may become unintended consequences were it to go into play. It is my opinion, and I'm only one of 18, but it is my opinion that we need to approach the General Assembly to try to get these changes so that we can move to the aggregate model versus the 4 standalone accountability pieces that are currently prescribed by Senate Bill 599.
Andrew, this may be a silly question. The legislative provision on the 2-year retention component that could replace part of 599 is legislation, is proposed legislation.
Yes.
We would have to speak to that as well, because just speaking to the nuance speaking to our proposed changes is only one part of this. If that 2-year retention piece goes in, it has its own set of implications for EPPs where they're held accountable for an indicator over which they have virtually no control. And so I don't know if we need to do both. And I realize that bill's moving right now. If that were to go into place, it creates its own dilemma that.
So again, I wonder if is it worth? I'm looking at the board lawyer. Is it worth doing a motion to see if it's the will of the commission to try and have a conversation with the General Assembly in whatever means and capacity in these two areas that are being discussed? Or is that, what technically we should?
Let me further ask this, Eric, if you don't mind. If Pepsi makes no decision on this issue to send to the state board this month, if we delayed a month to see what the temperature was in the General Assembly on this, would it cause a problem in any timeline prescribed in law that would set us back? From what I can see, I do not believe that it will. State board could always waive second reading.
To your question first, Mr. Chair, I agree, subject to check. I would want to pull the statute and confirm. With respect to a motion from the committee, I think that's really the committee's prerogative, the extent to which it would want to formally adopt a position to move forward, or if members wanted to approach legislators and other policymakers, certainly that's a perfectly appropriate approach as well.
Okay, thank you.
The only other thing I'd just bring to my fellow commission members' attention is that as we've done this work, we've tended to look pretty carefully at what Tennessee has done, given some of the results they've seen, and also the fact that they're a few years ahead of us on this program, like law, programmatic policy implementation, and there's probably lessons to be learned. That comes up for me just thinking about the potential shift that would be bring in a fourth, or change the fourth performance standard. They do have that in law, kind of the retention and kind of, it'd be interesting to see how that's played out. To see closer partnerships between LEAs and EPPs to say, hey, it is in our control to make sure somebody gets through 2 years, but we're gonna have to really work closely with partners, whatever those things might be. But I would encourage us to learn as much as we can. I know we're a great state and we have a lot of answers, but we maybe should also have a lot of questions.
That is a good point as well. And with the retention, does that mean in North Carolina, or does it mean in one school, one LEA?
It would be within North Carolina, so we would track by employment. So if somebody was in Durham and then moved to Johnston County,
Gotcha.
we would still have that data. They would still count as staying within the state.
Andrew, and I pulled up 107, and it's cruising along through the legislative process. Is the purpose of that bill to be affixed to some parts of 599? Is it its own? What is the purpose of the bill?
I want to be very explicit that I cannot.
As you understand it.
I have no idea what the will of the legislature is within these specific laws. I'm not privy to those conversations.
I appreciate it.
I mean, I can tell you that when I've talked to a variety of stakeholders in other meetings regarding policy and things that are moving, the suggestion has been to leverage the fact that there are bills in the works right now, that these adjustments could be easily added, that it's a lighter lift than trying to start from scratch. So I can say that the suggestion from a variety of stakeholders is try and do it now, while the thing is still cooking, as opposed to waiting. Or starting from scratch at a later time. So if that's of any use.
part of the reason for asking that, now that I'm looking at some of the details of the bill, if the bill passes, there are far greater implications of this than just the 2-year retention piece, because it's gonna cause us to have to go back over and look at what the accountability and sanctions models are. It seems, as I'm scrolling through the kinds of data that the General Assembly would expect. So they get into detail about what are the data points, for instance, on people entering the EPPs.
Right. So so they have, I think, scroll down a little bit further. So they've made some adjustments to what are the expectations of the performance report and some of those components. But in terms of the actual accountability model, it still is within those 4. So yeah, we would have to change some of the measures that we're collecting and reporting on. But in terms of what's actually a part of the accountability model, it's still the original 3 and an adjusted number 4. Does that give you some clarity?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking the A through G performance data section. It lays out number of students who apply, number of students admitted, number of students completed the program, number of graduates of the EPP licensed, number of graduates employed, number of percentage who convert from residency to initial license, any other information required by federal law.
Right.
All that, by this bill passing, all of that would be loaded into the accountability model.
No. They would be loaded into the performance report.
Yeah.
So that's data to drive introspection for the EPPs, as well as for various stakeholders to know what's going on in those EPPs. And by the way, that while that sounds like a lot, we're already collecting almost 100% of that stuff already. Specifically, the changes that would be occurring is really trying to identify the differences that residency model comes into play, because that's a new one that's coming into play this year. But in terms of the measures that EPPs will be held to and will be sanctioned because of, is limited to the 4 on the first page.
Okay.
And my understanding is this, the second part, the B, helps clean up our IHE performance report. So for those of us who have been writing those for years, there's tons of data in there, and there are tons of pieces that no one seems to use or really care about.
Right. So, and just to help everybody understand what happens annually, there are two series of reports that have been expected from the legislature for a number of years. One is called a performance report, and you can think about that as a health check of, you go do your annual exam, and it's like, everything, you spend a whole day with the doctor, right? And they check you from head to toe for every possible thing that you could imagine. Those documents are somewhere between 30 and sometimes 70 pages each for each institution. They're quite laborious, and if you look at the way the thing is written, those are still in play. They will still go on. What has changed is that there is a second component, which is a sort of a dashboard, if you will, called a report card, an EPP report card. And that is taking all the heavy performance report data and rolling it up into a quick 1 or 2 page document. And what the lawmakers are intending going forward is that we actually create a dashboard online that's interactive and telescopic, so that if Dr. Houston wanted to look at and compare public schools to private schools on a particular measure that's been collected, that there's a series of protocols and you can pull that up. The idea is that we're too far into technology in today's society to have static documents, that the way people want to look at data is different for each person, and there should be mechanisms and business intelligence that would allow that to be easy to do. And so that is the will of the report card side of things, is that we would create an online dashboard to fulfill that. But yes, the performance reports are still in play. All the criteria that you mentioned, Dr. Dempsey, are going to be in that performance report. But the actual accountability of the EPPs would be limited to a minimum of the 4 that would be listed there, and if there are any additional, that is the will of the commission.
Is there any possibility that this legislation may have some data that isn't presently collected, but could you run some models?
Yes.
That said, here's X institution, if this is in place, this is what would happen?
Yes. So what we're doing behind the scenes is we're taking, we have those two models, right? And those two models are nuanced and they're weighted and so on and so forth. So what we've been working at with DPI and also with support from EPIC, which is a research arm of the North Carolina Public Schools, is we're trying to look at previous data, because many of the measures we've had for 10, 15 years, and try and create models to see if we cut the deck this way, this is what would happen in terms of sanctioning for this year, right? So we are in the process of that. That takes a lot of time and effort, and we might have something maybe next month towards that, where we could look at different things. But to say back to you, all of that is moot if there's no nuance to, if it's an on-off switch by any of those criteria. So that's contingent on us having a more nuanced model.
I think that data, though, to your point, Dr. Houston, is that we would be able to make a much more informed decision as a commission if we knew very specifically what the consequences of our actions or recommendation would be based on the models that you're referring to.
Right. So what we're doing right now is we are trying to create cut scores, right, or thresholds by which those things, by which EPPs should be held accountable to each of those measures, and that we should be able to get to you. My hope is that we would get that to you next month.
And I also fear that I'm probably totally off base on this, but there are a lot of people out there that only think of teacher preparation at East Carolina or Appalachian or State. They forget about all those others out there that may have a very limited program, very few participating in the program. They could be closed down in a heartbeat.
That's correct. And
they won't meet a lot of those criteria.
Right, and I think looking at data that we have as a primer for making ultimate decisions on where those cuts get made has real importance on looking at all the different kinds, so that the decision and the will of this commission is an equitable decision, and takes the different EPPs into consideration. Because we also have, in addition to institutions of higher ed, we now have for-profit entities that are not degree-producing folks. So there's a variety of different conditions out there that could cause some unintended consequences depending on how that deck is cut.
In response to that, Dr. Houston, one opinion I have developed is that while I think we need to change the aggregate and the sanction model, the idea of having a limited number of outcomes-based things that we hold all EPPs accountable to, I actually think could help some of the smaller programs, because it's, they can do those things, right? Or if they can't, then maybe they need to relook at their model.
If it can be delimiting.
Yeah.
That first, the proposal under law at the present time doesn't have any delimitation to it. It's cut and dry and will have implications in different ways across different entities.
Pardon me for being simple. I'm still tired from the hurricane. That's my answer to everything. So we're developing an accountability model, what we discussed this morning. In House Bill 107, that we will continue to provide the data that comes in through what is called the performance report.
Yes, sir.
That is not consequential. There are no sanctions tied to that.
Some pieces of it will be pieces that are within those four accountability measures.
Then,
but, yes.
Okay, and I may be far more conservative than I think I am. As a member of the commission and as a dean of an EPP, to me, I see no reason for the state to continue to collect data that goes into the performance reports if it is not part of this, because the performance reports come off as at a minimum redundant, and at worst bureaucratic providing of information that has no real stated consequence in a process of ensuring on behalf of the public the quality of an EPP. So to me, we either pull what's going to go in the performance report, make sure it's, it's not up there anymore, make sure it's in the accountability model. We do not adopt 107, and that the accountability model EPP is recommending actually displaces the performance report. We eliminate the submission of a report by doing the new model. But only if 107 goes away and the data we typically submit is incorporated into the standards in the accountability model.
So let me just say something back to you about that. Like, I do think that the things that the state collects that are not a part of the accountability model really have important potential for the institution for its own school improvement planning, as well as potentially national accreditation and some of the other things that institutions work towards.
That's what accountability is.
I hear that. I think some of the measures that we're collecting, well, I think there is value to the data that are in the performance report. I don't know that some of the measures in there, while they are useful for an institution to think reflectively about what it's doing, are as important to be standalone as a part of the accountability model. I hear what you're saying. I also think this may be a heavier lift for us to get a legislative change to remove essentially 90% of what they're asking for us to collect. I think that may be. I don't know. That's certainly.
I'm not
something we
saying
could do.
don't collect it. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is if we're collecting it, let's add meaning to it by putting it in the accountability model, which gives purpose for its collection. If we collect it through all of these reports and it has no standing in any kind of process other than we know something we didn't know, leave that to the EPP. That should sit at the level of the individual institution to have that data and do what they do with it. Seems to me we're submitting a report to the state that goes before the board, but is completely, it lacks, I'm not saying there should be a consequence in an accountability sense. I'm saying, what is the purpose of the state having the data?
Well, I think in some cases it's to look in aggregate across the state as to what's going on in terms of shifts by the various measures that are in place. And I think some of this is specific measures that have accrued over time, over 10, 15, 20 years of adjustments to requirements in EPP policy, right? So I mean, I don't know that I can answer that.
It's back to my original question about the commission. Does the commission want to articulate a position on House Bill 107? Because to me, it seems to be regulation on top of regulation. And what we want to do is make the accountability plan, we're going to propose the core structure. Versus reporting, doing the accountability model, which I think we've done a very good job of building that versus reporting for the sake of reporting. Because if the data is important to know as a matter of the public trust in the accountability, in the work of EPPs, it's important to have in the accountability model. And if it's not important enough to be in the accountability model, why do we have it? I'm not, you're not responsible for that.
No,
I'm saying as a commission, that to me is what makes 107 it's problematic because of this retention. It displaces and puts retention in there. EPPs really can't do anything about retention. But it also raises this question about just the layers of regulation. We're now creating a new mechanism for regulation on top of one we already have. Just as a commissioner, I'm sharing that perspective.
Okay. So I think that at this particular point, we need to decide as a commission if we want to vote on the accountability model as prescribed currently by Senate Bill 599, or if we want to postpone that vote indefinitely while we try to seek a legislative relief, as we discussed earlier, for the accountability and the sanctions model. So I will listen to commission members' opinions on that at this time.
And did you give a timeline for when you think the possible thresholds or cut scores based on the data from Epic might come back out?
Yeah, I think we can have some data. I mean, step one is to create the databases so that we have databases on each of these measures, which we now have. We finished that this morning. Step two is to look at that and then cut it a variety of ways. Let's look at it by standard deviations. Let's look at it by, percent agreement. Let's look at it the various ways that are well defensed, right, and appropriate ways to look and cut the deck, and then to create a couple of different ways to look at that. That's what has to happen this month, and my hope is that we should have that kind of data out for the commission to digest in the coming weeks. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
What is the pleasure of the commission?
I don't know if it's a motion, but I don't have enough information that I could vote either way. So I think I would propose that we delay awaiting additional information and clarification about next steps based on what the General
I agree
Assembly
with
says
Dr.
back to us, I suppose.
Okay. So are you also then saying, are you championing the notion of speaking with the general
I propose that we take our message to the General Assembly looking at some alternatives to the present proposal.
So let's explicitly state for the record what changes we are going to ask the General Assembly to make, so that we are all clear and that I don't make a misstep in trying to work with those that I need to work with. So I think we want to include the aggregate language that we've seen.
Right. So I think I've let me see if I can put it into words. So I heard two things today. One, I've heard for a number of weeks, which is this idea of changing the sanctions language to allow for averaging, right, as opposed to one and done. And then I heard a proposal from Dr. Dempsey today, which is this idea of should there be further modifications potentially, or should the General Assembly consider further modifications to limit that what we're collecting is what is the accountability model, and all the superfluous things that are happening behind the scenes, which are not a part of the accountability model, are they still, is that worth continuing to do, or why are we doing that? So I heard those two things, and you may want to further flesh that out.
Well, I was just gonna say on the chairman's, question, the slide 19 and 20, or slide 19, the red,
Language.
inserts, isn't that the intent of that, is to
That would be
write that language?
that would be step one. That's the one that the subcommittees have worked on for a couple of weeks, and then which I think is different than what you just proposed today. So I think we probably should hear the will of the commission on both of those items.
I particularly think that the overall, that language is, I would assume, I've heard no opposition to that language. I think where I'm a little unclear on is the 107 language, but I think further modifications to that bill are needed to limit the data collected, so that what is collected is that is used in the accountability model. Did I understand that correctly, Dr. Dempsey?
Yes, and if the state is going to require the submission of that data, it should be included in the accountability model. But parentheses, if it's not, what is the purpose of that data? That needs to be clarified.
I've got that.
At the state level, what's the purpose?
I mean, as I try and play that out in my mind, because I'm the guy that makes all these reports behind the scenes, when I think about some of the narrative stuff that we ask, that's going to be really problematic to convert into some sort of an accountability measure. And the intent of some of that language is to say, what kind of relationships are EPPs building with LEAs out in the community, and how are they interacting in meaningful ways. That's both for the MSA programs and the undergraduate programs, and so EPPs then do their due diligence to share all the various things that they do. I don't know how that gets converted into some sort of a accountability like it's problematic to do that if in some areas.
Right, and what you just said I think is great. Then and so separate that out from the accountability model. Then the question becomes, outside of an accountability model, how does what you just said get operationalized? Does it get shared across the EPPs? Are there conferences or functions where we come to know how 9 different EPPs partner with? So I'm not saying that the information is not important. What I'm saying is, from a policy perspective, what happens to it as a result of collecting it? It's clear in the accountability model what happens with that data and why it's important.
Right.
So for everything else, what's the functionality of having it at the state level?
Right. So altruistically, I can say it would be helpful for institutions who are seeking new ways to do things to look at other institutions and to learn from some of the other data and to interact in meaningful ways. I can tell you in practicality, as the guy who creates thousands of pages of reporting, that it sits on a shelf and collects dust. I mean, that factually.
And this is not a criticism, that's my point.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. So now one alternative to that is, the hope is that the interactive dashboard that we're building, which will contain this, will allow stakeholders, legislators, LEAs, all these different stakeholders to be able to pull data in meaningful ways to drive pipeline, to drive hiring, decision making, to drive regional understandings. I think the telescopic nature of an online dashboard does enable that data to be used in ways that my prior static documentation has been largely useless in. So there's a caveat there that I think the online dashboard could really empower and enable a number of those data points.
That would render 107 unnecessary.
One of the things that I'm a little bit torn by, I guess I'm thinking about how we look at it, at accountability from an item analysis to a composite. Mm-hmm. But a composite or an aggregation of performance can hide,
yes,
can mask other problems.
Right. So on average,
so
average,
I want both.
Yeah.
But yeah. I don't know. But I just think we've got to have more information, because that's an example of a school that could meet the threshold mm-hmm. and be doing a miserable job with a subset of kids.
That's right.
Or performance issues, and that should not be hidden.
Right. So let me. You bring up a really excellent point. So let me flesh that out a little bit. And can you pull up the PowerPoint that we were using and go to one of those the tables that had that thing. Thank you. So this is an argument that Dr. Marr and I, or a conversation we've had for a number of years. Really, almost in the first month that I met Dr. Marr, I was doing some of the reporting conversations, and one of the things he said is, when you do this stuff in aggregate, I might as well just throw the thing in the can in terms of having fierce conversations back at my institution. Because
stir it up.
Yeah, because what I really want to do is I want to see that this program that I'm suspecting is a challenge or a hotspot for me, you're not getting deep enough for me to be able to point the finger at that particular program and say, not good enough, how can we make that better? And the faculty are just saying, yeah, man, on average, we're doing fine, see you later. And so I think there are two, and this is part of what goes back to what Dr. Tomberlin and our shop's intent of that online dashboard is that educator preparation is one of all components of human capital to be a part of that. And as we think about this, you can think of this in two different ways. One is what is the stakeholder on the public side viewing. So if you look at the table that we have up here, right here, what I would argue is that what you would be seeing publicly would be the overall across each of the components and the overall, essentially the edge, right? So that you would see as a public consumer, is my school overall doing well or not, right? And then to your point, Dr. Houston, there are plenty of things, in the weeds, skeletons in the closet that need to be surfaced. But I don't know that that is helpful for the public, but I think it's essential for the EPPs to have a very clear understanding of disaggregated data across all of these measures and whatever other measures that we can produce in a meaningful way. And so internally, the EPPs would then idealistically have all of the data on that table, not just the overarching data. And that would allow them to target specific supports, seek additional information from other institutions, ask questions, and to target hotspots that are challenges. So I think we're trying to get at what you're concerned about.
And to add to that, and I think it's why part of the reason the subcommittees want the more agile model. In the accrediting world, you can be accredited, but you can have an area that needs improvement. So you're accredited in full standing, but we're watching this particular area, a monitoring process. So you've met the standard. Your program is going to move along. But we do have this one area. We're looking at the demographics of your candidates. I think we don't have that option right now. It's either the switch is on or off.
Right.
Okay, so Sam, you had begun to make a motion. Did you
I
want
don't know
to?
what it is anymore.
Well, to continue I think I would really like to see the models that you're running.
Okay.
Before we make, I don't want to vote on something when I have no idea how it would affect boots on the ground.
So it seems to me that there's two things happening. One is, I think, what Dr. Houston brought up, which is this idea of talking with the General Assembly about the modification of the sanctions at the very least, and maybe make a case for what Dr. Dempsey was mentioning. All of this other stuff, all of this other, cooking up different models and things is somewhat moot.
Until we know that.
Until we know that. So step one is
Right.
the intent of the General Assembly to keep it the way it is, or is this a clerical error that needs to be corrected? If it's corrected, well, now we can look at the nuanced approaches and design a model that we think, and we have the accountability and sanctions crews have made really strong efforts towards that end. So you're not starting from scratch. We have essentially 3 models we can look at, and we could pick that up at that point. So I think what I'm hearing Dr. Houston say is, making a motion to bring a conversation, to try and bring a conversation to the General Assembly. That's what I thought I heard.
Okay.
Agree.
All right. So Dr. Houston has made a motion to carry this conversation to the General Assembly, and I will need a second.
Second.
And I have a second to that motion to take the message to the General Assembly to see about changing some of this language. Is there any further discussion before I call a vote? Hearing none, all in favor of this motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Are there any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. So thank you, Dr. Seiberg. I know that was a heavy lift.
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and just as we go forward, know that we'll continue to build those models regardless of what is happening behind the scenes, and we'll work with the board to find the appropriate channels to make the most assertive connections that we can to make the case that's been proposed.
Thank you. And again, thank you to the subcommittees for your work on these issues. So thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for today's discussion. I'd like to remind commission members that our next standing meeting will be held here on Thursday, June 13th from 9 to noon. We've now completed our meeting, and unless there's additional business, I would ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Have a motion to adjourn. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you.